President Biden has now published an op-ed in the Washington Post about his forthcoming trip, saying, quote, "On Wednesday, I depart for Europe on the first foreign travel of my presidency. It's a trip stacked with meetings with many of our closest Democratic partners, including the Group of Seven, our NATO allies, the leadership of the EU, before concluding by meeting with Vladimir Putin. In this moment of global uncertainty," he says, "this trip is about realizing America's renewed commitment to our allies and partners and demonstrating the capacity of democracies to both meet the challenges and deter the threats of this new age." He says, quote, "This is a defining question of our time. Can democracies come together to deliver real results for our people in a rapidly changing world? Will the democratic alliances and institutions that shaped so much of the last century prove their capacity against modern-day threats and adversaries?" President Biden concludes by saying, "I believe the answer is yes. And this week in Europe, we have the chance to prove it." Can democracies deliver real results for our people? Can they? Can the democratic system of government show it's up to meeting the moment? President Biden has articulated this over and over again, that this is our job in the world right now, to show that democracies can do, to show that democracy isn't a quaint but defunct means of government that's too messy to actually do things that countries need to do in the modern age. That's the case that's being made by the rising autocracies and authoritarian governments all over the world, most loudly by Russia and by China. Right? The United States, under President Biden, is trying to be not only the loudest voice against authoritarianism in the world, but the best example of why the authoritarian model is wrong and not as good as democracy at delivering for its people. The problem with this is we do actually need to be a good example of governing ourselves in order to win this argument. Our democratic system of government actually does have to do stuff that's good for the country in order to win this argument in the world. And that is not necessarily happening right now. Here's how National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan put it today at the White House briefing, right after President Biden had made his call to the president of Ukraine.
My second question, Jake, on voting, the For the People's Act. If it is not passed, is it a national security issue?
I would say the basic notion of democratic reform and voting rights in the United States is a national security issue. We are in a competition of models with autocracies, and we are trying to show the world that American democracy and democracy writ large can work, can effectively deliver the will of the people, and to the extent that we are not updating, refurbishing, revamping our own democratic processes and procedures to meet the needs of the modern moment, then we are not going to be as successful in making that case to the rest of the world, to China, to Russia, or to anyone else. And so there is a national security dimension to this today.
There is a national security dimension to this. The United States is in a competition of models with autocracies. We are trying to show the world that American democracy and democracy writ large can work effectively to deliver the will of the people. There's a national security dimension to this. China and Russia, the other authoritarian and autocratic regimes out there, are basically offering the world themselves as what they claim is a better model for how government should work. They're saying democracies are failures. Democracies can't get anything done. They're weak and slow. Elections are just theater. Elections don't really give people a say in their government, despite all the highfalutin talk about all that. They say democracy is basically a fraud. Elections are a joke. If you want to get something done, you want to live in a country that's going to actually meet the moment, you should just have a dictator. It's quicker. It's easier. It actually works. That's their case. Us making the counter argument that democracy is a better way for humans to govern themselves is a noble thing. And I think an ennobling idea for thinking about our place in the world. But when the rubber hits the road, in terms of us setting a good example, we have a couple of real challenges for that here at home. I mean, the first and most obvious one is that former President Trump and his supporters, increasingly his party as a whole, they're making it their whole purpose in life right now. The whole main focus of what they're doing in politics to undermine the last election, to undermine the idea of elections as definitive statements of the will of the people at all. Their most important task right now, the litmus test for support for Republican politicians by the former president, is if they promote this fiction that the former president, President Trump, wasn't really voted out of office. It's interesting. When CNN posted that audio today of Giuliani's call to the Ukrainian government, reporters Matthew Chance and Marshall Cohen at CNN said, quote, "The Giuliani call was one of the opening salvos in the years-long quest by Trump and his allies to subvert the 2020 election and damage Biden by soliciting foreign meddling in the election, by lying about voter fraud, by attempting to overturn the election results, and by inciting the deadly January 6th assault on the Capitol." Right. Yes. It's all part of the same thing. I mean, if we're trying to show the world that democracy works, free and fair elections are the rightful and righteous way that free people express their political views and choose their political leaders in the direction of their nation, then it's a problem when one of our two major parties in this country decides they reject and deny and defy election results if they don't produce their desired result. And after an election that produces not their desired result, they not only seek to overturn that election result and delegitimize it, they set about partisan efforts to take over the election process themselves whenever and wherever they can, to make it not a technocratic good government thing that we do as a country, to make it a thing that Republicans control so they can deliver Republican wins. President Trump gave his big return to politics speech this weekend in North Carolina. At that speech, he called the 2020 election a crime. Got a big ovation for that. Simultaneously in Georgia, that state Republican Party held their convention this weekend, too. They booed and booed their state's Republican governor, Brian Kemp. They passed a censure resolution against their Republican Secretary of State, all because they didn't accede to Trump's demand that they overturn the election result in that state after he lost to Joe Biden in that state. So that's one of the challenges here at home for us making the case to the world for democracy and voting rights and free and fair elections that we all agree to abide by. That's the challenge on the Trump Republican side. Republicans aren't so sure they're on board with democracy in that way anymore. But on the other side, the challenge is whether Democrats are going to be able to do anything about it, whether Democrats are going to be able to get something done in this part of governing, whether they can actually do something, whether they can effectuate something, whether they can deliver reforms to protect democracy against these internal threats, reforms to protect democracy and protect voting rights.